The pristine cabin of the first-class section hummed with the familiar white noise of flight, creating that peculiar bubble where strangers exist in temporary proximity, yet remain worlds apart. Mark Daniels, a 38-year-old investment banker from Boston, settled into his premium leather seat with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to luxury. The flight from Los Angeles to New York stretched before him, 5 hours of uninterrupted time to prepare for tomorrow's presentation, a pitch that could potentially salvage his firm's struggling entertainment division. The air inside the cabin carried that distinctive blend of recycled oxygen, subtle perfumes, and the faint aroma of warmed nuts being prepared in the galley. Mark adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, a small ritual of comfort before the long journey. The cabin's lighting had been dimmed to a soft amber glow, creating an illusion of intimacy in a space designed for privacy amid proximity. "Another Macallan, sir?" The flight attendant appeared at his side, her practiced smile reflecting years of cultivated hospitality. "Please, neat this time." Mark handed her his empty glass, noting how the ice had melted into perfect transparency. He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a gift to himself after closing a particularly lucrative deal last year. The irony wasn't lost on him that the timepiece had cost more than what many people earned in a year, yet he used it primarily to count down the minutes until he could return to his empty Manhattan apartment. 3 rows ahead, a figure in a rumpled hoodie and basketball shorts boarded, head slightly bowed beneath a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The casual attire stood in stark contrast to the pressed suits and refined ensembles typical of the cabin's clientele. The man moved with a certain reluctance, as if uncomfortable with the scrutiny that inevitably follows those who appear out of place in carefully curated environments. Mark observed with growing irritation as the casually dressed passenger settled into a window seat, immediately reclining and spreading out with what Mark perceived as unearned comfort. The passenger's weathered New Balance sneakers, not the limited edition collaborations that occasionally appeared in first class, but genuinely worn athletic shoes, were propped against the bulkhead in a way that struck Mark as deliberately careless. "Another celebrity who thinks the rules don't apply," Mark muttered to his seatmate, a woman engrossed in her tablet who merely nodded without looking up. The comment hung in the air between them, neither acknowledged nor rejected. Through the narrow aisle, Mark could see the hooded figure accept a bottle of water from the attendant, waving off the offered champagne with a gesture that seemed almost dismissive to Mark's watchful eye. The casual rejection of luxury, a luxury that Mark had worked 16-hour days to afford, sparked an irrational flare of resentment. The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin's murmur as she continued offering pre-departure beverages to the hooded figure. The man's response was quiet but carried a distinctive, familiar cadence that triggered something in Mark's memory, a voice he had heard before, not in person but through screens both large and small. He leaned forward, squinting slightly to get a better look at the partially obscured face. "Is that Adam Sandler?" he asked aloud, not particularly directing the question at anyone. "I believe so," replied the woman beside him, finally looking up from her screen. "He's filming something in New York, I think. My daughter mentioned it on our call yesterday. Something about a dramatic role for once." Mark's expression hardened as recognition crystallized. His recent investment in a production company had gone south after a high-profile comedy project collapsed. The star had withdrawn at the last minute, citing creative differences that resulted in significant losses for investors like Mark. Though Sandler hadn't been involved in that particular project, he represented the Hollywood machine that had cost Mark nearly $2 million and considerable face with his firm's partners. "What's someone like that doing in first class anyway?" Mark mumbled, aware of the absurdity of his question, even as it left his lips. His last 3 movies went straight to streaming. The woman beside him raised an eyebrow but returned to her tablet without comment. Mark felt a flush of embarrassment at his transparent bitterness, but couldn't seem to bottle the emotion back up. The resemblance to his current situation, seeing someone who embodied the industry that had recently burned him, sparked an irrational surge of resentment that pulsed beneath his carefully maintained exterior. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, Mark found himself standing, ostensibly heading to the lavatory. Instead, he paused by the row where the hooded figure sat, now unmistakably Adam Sandler, who was quietly reviewing what appeared to be script pages marked with fluorescent highlights and handwritten notes in the margins. "You know," Mark began, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby passengers, "some of us worked hard to be in this cabin. We didn't just make a career out of acting like overgrown children. The cabin's ambient noise seemed to dim as passengers registered the confrontation unfolding in their midst. Several pairs of eyes darted up from books and screens, then quickly away, the practiced non-observation of those accustomed to pretending not to notice uncomfortable situations in confined spaces. A flight attendant paused in the galley, assessing whether intervention was necessary. Sandler looked up, surprise evident in his expression, quickly replaced by something more measured. A carefully neutral mask that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with unprovoked hostility. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes moving from Mark's face to his clenched hand, then back up. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than his on-screen persona would suggest. "I'm sorry you feel that way, man." The response was so understated, so devoid of the expected celebrity indignation, that it momentarily derailed Mark's simmering anger. The simple acknowledgement, neither defensive nor confrontational, hung in the air between them as the engines hummed their constant mechanical reminder of their shared journey through the stratosphere. The flight attendant materialized almost instantly at Mark's side, her professional smile barely concealing concern. Years of training in handling disruptive passengers had given her an almost preternatural ability to appear precisely when tensions threatened to escalate beyond the carefully maintained decorum of first class. "Sir, can I help you find your seat?" Her hand hovered near but did not touch Mark's elbow, a gesture that managed to be both courteous and subtly authoritative. The scent of her subtle perfume momentarily cut through the recycled air, grounding the moment in sensory reality. "I'm fine," Mark replied, his eyes still locked on Sandler. He straightened his posture, suddenly aware of how he must appear to the other passengers, a man in an expensive suit harassing someone who clearly wished to be left alone. The realization did nothing to dissipate his irritation, instead adding a layer of self-consciousness that only intensified his discomfort. "Just sharing some thoughts with our celebrity passenger. Thought he might appreciate some feedback from someone who isn't paid to laugh at his jokes." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A distinguished older gentleman 2 rows back closed his book with a snap that seemed deliberately loud. The confrontation had crossed the invisible boundary of first-class decorum, where conflicts were typically handled through discreet complaints to staff rather than direct confrontation. "Actually," Adam replied, closing the script he'd been reviewing and placing it carefully in the seat pocket, "I'd be happy to hear your thoughts." He gestured to the empty seat beside him, vacated earlier when its occupant had moved to be closer to a traveling companion. The studio always sends yes men. Real feedback is valuable. The unexpected response momentarily disarmed Mark, who had anticipated either celebrity indignation or practiced indifference. This invitation to dialogue didn't fit his narrative of the entitled star, and the sudden script change left him without a prepared response. Reluctantly, and with the flight attendant's cautious nod, Mark took the offered seat. Up close, he noticed the fatigue etched in Sandler's features, the slight shadows beneath his eyes, the tension held in his jaw, the faint redness around his eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. These weren't the marks of someone who'd spent the night partying, but rather someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Look, I'm sorry for the approach," Mark began, his voice dropping to a more conversational volume as the initial surge of adrenaline began to fade. "It's been a rough week. Investment gone bad in the entertainment sector. Nothing to do with you personally." Sandler nodded, a simple acknowledgement that neither accepted nor rejected the partial apology. The overhead light caught the silver threading its way through his curly hair, a detail rarely visible in carefully lit film shots. "I've got a 6-year-old in the hospital in New York," Sandler said quietly once Mark had settled. His fingers toyed with the corner of his boarding pass, folding and unfolding the upper edge with an absent rhythm that suggested a habitual nervous gesture. "Cancer. Not mine, my sister's kid. I've been helping with treatment costs and trying to boost his spirits between chemo sessions." He turned his phone screen toward Mark, revealing a photo that stood in stark contrast to the carefully staged publicity shots that typically populated celebrity social media. The image showed Sandler in a hospital room, surrounded by children in various stages of treatment, all wearing pajamas and broad smiles. The actor himself looked different here, more present, less the performer and more simply a man sitting cross-legged on a hospital floor, a child's half-finished puzzle spread before him. "This was yesterday," Sandler continued, his voice maintaining that same measured calm. "I do this whenever I can. No publicity, no cameras except for the parents who want pictures for their kids." The hospital staff are amazing, but they're overworked. And these kids, they just want to laugh. Most of them don't even know my movies. They're too young. I just become the silly guy who'll wear a superhero cape and make dumb jokes about hospital food. The revelation landed like a physical weight on Mark's chest. The narrative he had constructed of the entitled celebrity collapsed against the reality before him. He felt the uncomfortable warmth of shame creeping up his neck as he recalibrated his understanding of the man sitting beside him. "I'm wearing this," Sandler continued, gesturing to his casual attire, "because I left the hospital at 4 a.m. and came straight to the airport. My nephew had a rough night. The nurses thought having a familiar face there might help during a particularly tough round of medication. I didn't want to miss the flight because I promised I'd be back tomorrow with a new toy he's been asking about." Mark's face flushed with the dawning realization of his error. The cabin seemed suddenly warmer, the eyes of fellow passengers burning with silent judgment. He was acutely aware of having become the villain in a story he had mistakenly believed himself to be the hero of. "I didn't know," Mark said finally, the inadequacy of the response painfully apparent even as the words left his mouth. "No reason you would," Sandler replied with a slight shrug. "That's the thing about this job. Everyone thinks they know you because they've seen you pretend to be different people. But that's not really knowing someone, is it?" The question hung in the air between them, philosophical in its simplicity, yet profound in its implications. Mark found himself without a ready answer, a rare occurrence for someone whose professional success relied on quick, confident responses. "The movies, they're just part of it," Sandler continued when Mark remained silent. "Some are good, some are, well, let's just say I've made some choices I knew weren't going to win awards." A self-deprecating smile briefly softened his features. "But they employ hundreds of people, many of whom have been with me for decades. Camera operators whose kids I've watched grow up, costume designers who were there for my wedding. It's a family business in more ways than people realize." Mark thought of the spreadsheets waiting on his laptop, the columns of numbers that represented films not as creative endeavors but as investment vehicles. He had never considered the human ecosystem behind each production, the network of livelihoods dependent on each project moving forward. "The nephew," Mark began, then paused, uncertain of the appropriate question to ask. "Jake," Sandler supplied. "He's got about a 60% chance, better odds than he had 6 months ago. But still," he trailed off, his gaze shifting to the window where nothing was visible but darkness and the occasional distant pinprick of light. "We take it day by day." An hour into the flight, Mark sat alone at his original seat, the interaction with Sandler replaying in his mind. The woman beside him had requested a seat change shortly after his return, leaving him isolated with his thoughts and the growing weight of his behavior. He stared at the presentation materials open on his laptop, the words and figures blurring as his focus drifted repeatedly to the conversation that had transpired. The cabin lights had been dimmed further, creating pockets of privacy in the darkened space. Several passengers had donned sleep masks and reclined their seats to their fullest extent. The hushed atmosphere amplified Mark's sense of exposure, as if his earlier behavior had somehow marked him as separate from the collective tranquility that had settled over the cabin. 2 rows back, a passenger had recognized him as the confrontational man and was now recording a discreet video commentary on her phone. Mark could hear fragments. "Just went after Adam Sandler for no reason. Didn't know Sandler was visiting sick kids. Some Wall Street type thinking he's better than everyone." The modern consequence of public missteps unfolded in real time around him. By the time they landed, his moment of poor judgment would likely be circulating online, attached to his face and possibly his name. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built a career on calculating risk, yet had failed to consider the potential consequences of his impulsive confrontation. Mark closed his laptop, the presentation no longer holding his attention. The Macallan he had requested earlier sat untouched on his tray table, the amber liquid catching what little light remained in the cabin. He found himself unable to enjoy the expensive scotch, its presence now a reminder of the privileges he had taken for granted, privileges that had somehow become entitlements in his mind. He signaled to the flight attendant, who approached with visible reluctance. Her professional demeanor remained intact, but the warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions had noticeably cooled. "Could I send a drink to Mr. Sandler?" he asked, his voice subdued. "I'm sorry, sir. Mr. Sandler doesn't drink alcohol, especially when he's visiting his nephew," she replied, her tone professional but cool. "But I can deliver a note if you'd like." Mark nodded, accepting both the new information and the subtle rebuke contained in her response. He pulled a cocktail napkin from beneath his untouched glass and withdrew a Mont Blanc pen from his inner pocket. For several minutes, he stared at the blank napkin, words failing him in a way they rarely did during business negotiations. Finally, he scribbled a simple message. "I judged without knowing. I was wrong. If there's anything I can do to help with your nephew's treatment, here's my card." He added his business card and folded the napkin carefully before handing it to the attendant. He watched as she delivered it to Sandler, who read it with an unreadable expression before nodding slightly in Mark's direction. A small acknowledgement that contained neither forgiveness nor condemnation, merely recognition of the gesture itself. The actor tucked the card into the script he had been reviewing earlier, a motion that could have signified either consideration or mere politeness. The rest of the flight passed in uncomfortable silence for Mark. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had accused Sandler of entitlement while displaying exactly that behavior himself. The investment loss that had fueled his resentment now seemed trivial compared to what Sandler's family was facing. He found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the photo Sandler had shown him. The children with their two thin arms and bright smiles. The actor sitting cross-legged on a hospital floor rather than a movie set. It was a side of celebrity he had never considered, too consumed with his own narrative of the industry that had recently disappointed him. As the plane began its descent into New York, the captain's voice announced they were running ahead of schedule, estimating an arrival 20 minutes earlier than expected. The cabin stirred with renewed activity as passengers stowed their belongings and prepared for landing. Mark noticed Sandler on the phone the moment the announcement about electronic devices was made, his voice carrying just enough for Mark to catch fragments about meeting at the hospital entrance and bringing something called Mr. Whiskers. The conversation contained none of the affected importance that Mark had often overheard in executives' calls. No mentions of agents or directors or deals, just the simple logistics of coordinating a hospital visit. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, Mark found himself contemplating the strange intimacy of air travel, how it forced strangers into proximity that could either reveal or conceal character. He had boarded the plane thinking himself morally superior to the entitled celebrities he disdained, only to discover that his own sense of entitlement had blinded him to the complexities of others' lives. The aircraft taxied to the gate with mechanical precision, the final moments of the journey marked by the familiar symphony of unbuckling seatbelts, overhead compartments opening, and the rustle of passengers gathering belongings. Mark remained seated, allowing those around him to stand and form the customary queue in the aisle. Through the narrow gap between seats, he could see Sandler also waiting, phone to his ear again, his expression softening as he spoke to what Mark assumed must be his nephew. The tenderness in that moment, visible only in profile and partially obscured, contained more authenticity than any performance Mark had seen on screen. JFK Airport bustled with its usual controlled chaos as passengers disembarked. Mark deliberately took his time, allowing Sandler to exit well ahead of him. The terminal stretched before him, a cathedral of modern travel with its soaring ceilings and endless corridors, populated by travelers each immersed in their own journeys and concerns. The fluorescent lighting cast everyone in the same unflattering glow, temporarily equalizing the carefully maintained distinctions of the aircraft's cabins. Here, first-class passengers mingled indistinguishably with economy travelers, all subject to the same lines, the same announcements, the same fundamental experience of transition. As Mark made his way through the terminal, rolling his carry-on beside him with one hand while balancing his laptop bag on his shoulder, a commotion near the arrival gates caught his attention. A small crowd had gathered, phones raised to capture what appeared to be an impromptu moment of celebrity encounter. Against his better judgment, Mark found himself drawing closer, curiosity overcoming his earlier embarrassment. As the crowd shifted, he caught sight of Adam Sandler greeting a thin boy in a wheelchair. The child's face, pale but lit with excitement, transformed as Sandler presented him with a stuffed cat wearing a tiny hospital gown, complete with miniature medical bracelets and a bandage wrapped around one plush paw. Mr. Whiskers had his own surgery, Sandler was explaining, kneeling to be at eye level with the child. But the doctors say he's going to be just fine. He might need a little extra care for a while, though. Think you're up for that? The boy nodded solemnly, accepting the stuffed animal with the careful reverence of a child who had learned early that fragility wasn't limited to toys. What was wrong with him? He asked, his voice thin but clear in the airport's acoustic space. Well, Sandler replied, maintaining the serious tone that acknowledged the child's question as legitimate. He had something growing inside him that wasn't supposed to be there, just like you. But the doctors were able to take it out, and now he's getting stronger every day, just like you. Mark stood transfixed at the periphery of this moment. There were no publicists redirecting attention, no camera crews beyond the spontaneous documentation by delighted bystanders. This wasn't a publicity stunt orchestrated for maximum exposure. It was simply a man trying to bring joy to a child facing unimaginable challenges. A woman, presumably the boy's mother, stood nearby, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and the bone-deep weariness that comes from extended vigils beside hospital beds. She wore the unmistakable look of someone navigating a reality they never imagined would be theirs, all while trying to maintain normalcy for a child who knew no other experience. As if sensing observation, Sandler glanced up and met Mark's gaze across the terminal. For a moment, recognition flickered in his eyes. Then, surprisingly, he offered a small nod. Not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement of Mark's earlier apology and perhaps recognition of the humility it had required. A woman who had been on their flight approached Mark, her phone held casually at her side in a way that suggested it might be raised at any moment. "You're the guy who went after Sandler, right?" she asked, her tone holding more curiosity than accusation. Mark considered denial but instead nodded. "I was," he admitted, emphasizing the past tense. "I made a judgment without knowing the facts. I was wrong." The woman studied him for a moment, then lowered her phone decisively. "That's refreshingly honest, actually. Not something you hear much these days, especially in New York." She glanced toward where Sandler was now helping the boy adjust something on the wheelchair. "Looks like there's more to most stories than what we see at first glance." "Apparently so," Mark agreed, the simple acknowledgement containing layers of self-reflection that would have seemed foreign to him just hours earlier. As Mark made his way toward the exit, he passed a terminal television tuned to an entertainment news program. The anchor's voice competed with airport announcements as she discussed upcoming film releases, but it was the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen that caught Mark's attention. "Adam Sandler continues private support of children's cancer ward while filming new project." The juxtaposition of seeing the reality and then its media representation struck Mark as profoundly significant. How many other narratives had he accepted without question? How many judgments had he made based on incomplete information, shaped by his own biases and assumptions? His phone buzzed with an email notification as he stepped onto the airport's moving walkway. His assistant had sent a summary of tomorrow's presentation, highlighting the key points that needed emphasis for the potential investors. The investment numbers that had seemed so crucial hours ago now appeared in a different light, contextualized by his recent experience. Mark opened a new email instead, addressing it to his financial advisor. "Investigate options for donation to pediatric cancer research," he typed, the words appearing on screen with a finality that felt like commitment. "Specifically looking at programs that support families during treatment. Schedule meeting next week to discuss." He paused, then added, "Also, review our entertainment portfolio. Interested in productions with established track records of employee retention and community involvement. Value-based investing beyond just quarterly returns." The truth revealed on that flight wasn't just about Adam Sandler's private acts of kindness, though that had been the catalyst. It was about the stories we construct about others to justify our own behavior, and how those narratives crumble when confronted with reality. For Mark, it was a lesson in the danger of assumptions and the power of witnessing genuine humanity in unexpected places. As his taxi pulled away from the airport, Mark caught a final glimpse of Sandler helping his nephew into a waiting car, still making the boy laugh even as he carefully adjusted his oxygen tube. The image stayed with Mark long after the airport disappeared from view, a reminder that the truth often exists in the quiet moments never meant for public consumption. Back in his Manhattan apartment that evening, Mark stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The presentation materials for tomorrow lay on his dining table, but his thoughts remained with the scene at the airport. He realized that in his years of acquiring and leveraging wealth, he had gradually lost sight of what truly constituted value, not just in investment terms, but in human terms. The next morning, before heading to his presentation, Mark made a detour to a specialty toy store and purchased the most elaborate, highest quality stuffed animal they carried, a lion with articulated limbs and remarkably soft fur. He included a note with his business card, for Jake's collection to keep Mr. Whiskers company, No expectation of response, just paying forward a lesson learned. He had the store deliver it to the hospital address he'd found through a quick search, addressed simply to Jake, CO Adam Sandler, visiting. Whether it would reach its intended recipient was uncertain, but the gesture itself felt necessary. A small acknowledgement of the larger truth he had glimpsed briefly through a crack in his carefully constructed worldview. The truth was that humanity existed in the spaces between public personas and private realities, in the gap between perception and fact. And sometimes it took a moment of regrettable behavior to reveal that truth in all its complicated, humbling glory.